All right, good morning, baseball fans. And today we are going to get back to our Deadball Diaries series, which will be an interview, a very interesting interview, I think, with Fred Snodgrass. And I was going to initially go with Sam Crawford, but one of the stories that Snodgrass tells is one of the great pieces of lore from the Deadball era, and that is the story of Charles Victory Faust. So in keeping with the fact that there's really no recording of or a story that exists outside of this about Faust, and it's of course enabled people at Sabre to go back and do a lot of research on him. I thought this would be an appropriate interview to discuss, so we are going to go with that. And with that, we will get started again. These audio clips are from Lawrence Ritter, and this is from The Glory of Their Times, that excellent book from 1966, and these are the actual audio recordings of his interviews with these players. So here we go.
This, then, is the way it was. Listen. Fred Snodgrass.
This was 1911. The Giants were playing in St. Louis in the old National League Park there. And in those days, we didn't have a dugout. We had a bench under an awning about halfway between the grandstand and the foul lines. We were having batting practice. The Giants were. And out of the grandstand walks an individual, tall, lanky, in a dark suit with a black derby hat on. And he walked across the grass from the grandstand to the bench, and he said, "I'd like to talk to Mr. McGraw." And some of us there pointed at Mr. McGraw out, and he walked over to Mr. McGraw, and he said, "Mr. McGraw," he says, "my name is Charles Victory Faust, and I live over here in Kansas, and a few weeks ago I went to a fortune teller who told me that if I would join the New York Giants and pitch for them."
Just a quick, I guess, and we're going to fact check some of the stuff he talks about with Faust, but just a quick point there. No way to know if he introduced himself that way. His actual name was Charles Victor Faust, and he obviously had the nickname Victory. I don't know if it came from this story or something that McGraw or the Giants players possibly gave him, but just an interesting bit, and again, a minor correction there, and I guess it really doesn't matter, but his actual name is Charles Victor Faust, and he was born in Marion, Kansas on October 8, 1880.
That they would win the pennant. Well, Mr. McGraw looked at him, and being superstitious as most ball players were and are, he said, "Well, that's interesting. Take off your coat." And he said, "Here's a glove and the ball, and I'll get a catcher's mitt and I'll warm you up and see what you have." And so they got up in front of the bench and they tossed a few balls back and forth, and Charlie Faust said, "Well, I better give you my signals." So they got their heads together and he gave them 5 or 6 signals, and McGraw would give one signal and Charlie would wind up, and his wind up was like a windmill. Both arms went around in circles for quite a little while before he let go of the ball. Every different sign that McGraw gave, the ball came up just the same. There was no difference in them whatever. And there was no speed. It was probably enough to break a pane of glass, but that was about all. And so McGraw finally threw the glove away, and he caught him barehanded, because he said, well, to himself, "This guy's a nut." He said, "I'm going to have a little fun with him." He said, "All right, how about your hitting? Can you hit?" "Oh," he said, "pretty well." "Well," he said, "we're having batting practice. Get a bat and go up there." And he said, I want to see you run, so run it out." Word was passed around to the fellas that were shagging out in the infield. He dribbled one down to short. He juggled it a minute, and Charlie was turning first, and they slid him into second, and they slid him into third, and they slid him into home, and his best Sunday clothes. Well, that night we left for Chicago, and when we got down to the train,
Just a little more background. Of Faust's childhood, he was one of 6 kids, the oldest of 6 kids, and 4 of his siblings, including himself, actually did not outlive his parents. dying anywhere from infancy up to the age of 34, which was when Faust passed away. So what led up to this meeting in St. Louis is he allegedly was at a county fair and ran into a fortune teller who told him that if he joined the Giants and pitched, that they would win the pennant. So that was the whole impetus of him getting with John McGraw, or seeking out John McGraw prior to that game. And, and again, it had a very stark contrast to times now versus then, in that, there's no way in hell now you're going to walk down on a Major League Baseball field and have an audience with the manager prior to the game. But in that time, it actually was not that uncommon. Fans generally remained in the seats. But, in a time period where for big games, when they had sellout crowds, the owners, of course, wanting to get every piece of income possible, often would rope off the outfield, because the outfields, of course, back then, most of them were very cavernous, and they would go 5, 6, 7, 8, even 10 people deep in the outfield for big games, and often had patrons come down on the sidelines too, because even in the foul territory and behind home plate, a lot of the parks had a lot of extra space, and they would often place spectators there. And in fact, in one game, the 1912 matchup between Smokey Joe Wood and Walter Johnson, 1912, where Wood was chasing Johnson's American League record of consecutive victories. Child, I believe, I think it was 11 to 12-year-old Child, was in the roped off area behind home plate when those two squared off, and was actually struck in the head with a foul ball and had to be taken from the field via stretcher. No word on his condition, but again, even safety wasn't that much of a concern for the players or the spectators back in those days. Again, a stark contrast to what you will see today.
We got into our car. Who was in the Pullman car, our private car, except Charles Victory Faust? Everybody looked around in amazement, and McGraw said, well, he said, we're taking Charlie along to help us win the pennant. So, believe it or not, every day from that day on, Charles Victory Faust was in uniform, and he warmed up sincerely to pitch that game. He thought he was going to pitch that particular game. Every day this happened. He wasn't signed to a contract, but John J. McGraw gave him all the money that was necessary for him to keep himself neat. He went to the barber shop.
And again, one small fact check there, really doesn't matter. It's the story is very much on point. Again, 1911, this interview has taken place 55 years after those events, so you would expect Snodgrass to forget some facts. The Giants actually played a home game after the debut, if you want to call it that, of Victory Faust. And they let him, and the story, by the way, of letting him take batting practice and sliding him around is absolutely correct. That was basically confirmed as much as possible that they did do that to him, and he tore up his Sunday clothes, and also multiple abrasions on his skin. But in the second home game, or the last home game before the road trip, they did let him cavort around the field again, and I guess McGraw, being very superstitious, wanted to test this fortune teller's theory. And then there was, 2 games after that initial game where they let him do it again, and they won all 3 games. So they were scheduled to leave to St. Louis after those 3 games Faust showed up at. And, Snodgrass indicates he was on the Pullman car, and that necessarily wasn't the case either. He met them at the train station, and McGraw apparently gave him the runaround trying to get rid of him, and eventually they did get rid of him and went to St. Louis without him.
Shop almost every day for a massage and a haircut. He had plenty of money to tip the waiters in the small amounts that we tipped in those days. And we did win the pennant. The spring came around the next year, and Charles Victory Faust was in the training camp. He was very sincere. He really believed that he was the pitcher. He warmed up every day in 1912, And again, we won the pennant. In 1913, he was again in the spring training camp. He warmed up every day to pitch. And during that season, he became such a drawing card with the fans who would clamor for McGraw to put him in to pitch. So finally one day, against Cincinnati in New York, McGraw did put him in to pitch. And he pitched one full inning. And he didn't have enough to hit. They didn't score on him.
Okay. That's actually going to be our one major fact check. It's actually not correct. He did not pitch in 1913. In 1911, he did actually appear in 2 games. And the first game he pitched against was the, hold on. I don't even think it was Cincinnati. I have his second game up where he actually got to make a plate appearance too. All right, one second here, sorry. I had this fairly well drawn out, but yeah, so in 1911, he appeared in 2 games pitching for the Giants. So the first game was actually against Boston. Both of these appearances came after the Giants had clinched the pennant. And basically there was, New York at the time had 13 daily newspapers. And there was quite a following for Faust amongst the writers there. What's up, Al? Good to see you, buddy. Amongst the sports writers there among those 13 dailies. And a lot of them spent as much time interviewing Faust because he... more than likely had behavioral health issues, which we'll get to later in the story. But he was always good for a quote and, definitely was kind of a little on the nutty side. And he gave good fodder to the newspapers. So there was a lot of pressure from the newspapers. Damon Runyon was a writer that was involved in that to get him into pitch. So he did pitch against Boston initially on October 7th and pitched an inning, gave up a hit and a run. Double and then a sacrifice fly to allow a run there. And then he came back and pitched against Brooklyn 5 days later, also pitched an inning, gave up a hit, but did not allow a run in that game. So in 2 major league innings pitched, he had an ERA of 4.5, did not strike anyone out or walk anybody. So we'll come back to his hitting adventures as well, because I think Snodgrass is going to touch on them too. So yeah, a brief fact check there. He actually did pitch his first season with the Giants and not in 1913, as Snodgrass says.
One of those nothing ball pitchers, Well, it was Charlie Faust's turn to come to bat when 3 outs were made. And the Cincinnati team stayed in the field for the 4th out to let Charlie come to bat. And the same thing happened then that happened the first time that Charlie ever came on the field in St. Louis in his Sunday clothes. They slid him into first, second, third, and home. Well, he was such a drawing card at this stage, Larry, that a theatrical firm gave him a contract.
All right, so again, just continue with that fact check. That actually did happen, but again, it was 1911 Boston and not Cincinnati in 1913. So he was on deck when the final out was made of that game, and the teams, I guess, conspired to basically do the same, give him the same treatment that McGraw gave him when he initially showed up. So they stayed on the field, let him bat, put him basically through the same routine McGraw did until this time they tagged him out just shy of home plate. But again, Faust allegedly left the field very triumphant, saying that he had finally got to fulfill his wish. And the problem with that is now he really thought he was a Major League Baseball player. And quite frankly, outside of Eddie Goddell, who Bill Veeck put in as the midget, who Bill Veeck put in as a promotional stunt for the St. Louis Browns during his tenure there, Faust was probably the least athletically gifted person to ever appear in a major league game. So we'll get back to that story. But yeah, that did actually happen, though, after 3 outs were made. But he did get to bat in his next outing against Brooklyn. So we'll touch on that.
Broadway in one of those 6-a-day shows, starting in the afternoon, going through the evening. He got $400 a week for it. He dressed in the uniform. He imitated Ty Cobb and Christy Mathewson, Hannes Wagner, in a very silly way, of course, but seriously as far as Charlie was concerned. And the fans loved it, and they went to see Charlie on the stage. He was gone 4 days, and we lost 4 ball games. The 5th day, Charlie showed up at the Polo Grounds in the dressing room, and we all said to Charlie, "Well, Charlie, what are you doing here? How about your theatrical contract?" "Oh," he said, "fellas, I got to pitch today." He says, "You fellas need me." So he got out and warmed up with this windmill warm-up that he had that just tickled the fans, and we won. And we won the pennant again. Well, that fall, I joined a group of big leaguers, and we made a barnstorming trip.
All right, so, again, Snodgrass has some things wrong here, but he captures the spirit of the story. And quite honestly, without this interview, well, I could say almost certainly that the baseball world would never even know about Charles Victory Faust. He would just be a blip in a couple of box scores back from 1911. So in his final game, he did indeed get a vaudeville contract, and was absolutely horrible at that as well. And the Giants, in terms of their good luck charm, had the misfortune in 1911 and again later in 1913 of playing Connie Mack's Philadelphia A juggernaut of the teens before they were disbanded after losing the 14 series to the Miracle Braves. And ironically, you could say that McGraw's bunch was out hoodooed by Connie Mack's good luck charm, because he actually had a hunchback midget, Connie Mack did, named Louis Van Zelst, who was a longtime mascot for the Philadelphia A's, and they kept him as a good luck charm. So in the battle of the good luck charms in the 2 World Series they met in, Mack and the A's came out victorious in both of those. But getting back to his second at bat against Brooklyn, and in that game again he pitched an inning, gave up a hit, no runs. He came up in the bottom of the 9th. Again, the pennant was already clinched for New York, and Brooklyn was up 5-1 in this game. So they intentionally hit Faust, which I'm sure they took great delight in, knowing ball players then, and let him steal second and third, and then he came in to score on a suicide squeeze. So Charles Faust did actually score a run in his brief, comical major league career. So he's going to start talking about... I'm going to fill in some gaps. So he's going to jump right now to previous to the 1914 season, where Faust was allegedly encountered during this barnstorming tour. But I'll fill in the gaps between then. In 1912, Faust went back to Marion, and then finally to Hot Springs, Arkansas. And in February of 1912, he actually hooked up with Bill Dollins, Brooklyn Superbas, at spring training. And his purpose of doing that was to learn to pitch left-handed so that he'd be able to rejoin the Giants and be twice as valuable, because he could pitch both right-handed and left-handed, which is, again, kind of comical. And also ironic that you would go to a competing team, especially a New York team, to learn to pitch left-handed, ostensibly to help the crosstown rival Giants. So he did actually rejoin the Giants, and McGraw was kind of surprised. He thought he had kind of gotten rid of him after the 1911 series, but they did allow him to pitch an entire game in Hot Springs, and he allegedly held the opposition to 4 runs. But again, that only cemented the notion in his head that he was a capable major league pitcher. And at that point, he basically thrust himself upon McGraw once again, and the Giants were kind of over the Faust experiment, and they told him they were not going to pay his expenses on the road, which they did in 1911. but would allow him to, come on the field pre-game, basically like, one of the players' kids at the Polo Grounds, and warm up pre-game. But the Giants, of course, they did go on to win the pennant in 1912. They got off to probably one of the best starts in Major League history, going 54-11, which was a standard the Seattle Mariners were chasing even in 2001. And really, after Faust's arrival, up until this point, up to this start, they'd won basically 80% of their games. And a side note there, Rube Marquardt, who really is in the Hall of Fame, and probably only because of the interview he did in this book. I don't really think he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. But he was 33-2 pitching while Faust was with the Giants and around during those games, and including his first 19 decisions in 1912. And after Faust departed, he was a sub-500 pitcher the rest of the season, and that's what happened in 1912. Basically, McGraw had kind of grown, was over Faust basically, as he'd worn out his patience, and because Faust was always on him to pitch. So Faust was finally persuaded to return to Kansas and await the summons from McGraw. And again, they tricked him, saying once the Giants see how much they need you, they'll get you back and keep you. So the Giants got rid of him that way finally. And again, though, they did win the pennant in 1912, losing to the Red Sox in that World Series. It was, for all intents and purposes, the end of Charlie Faust in the major leagues. So we'll get to the rest of Snodgrass's story here, and we'll unfortunately have to fact check that a little bit as well, but here we go.
Starting in Chicago and going through the Northwest and down the coast and over to Honolulu. And in Seattle, who came down to the hotel to see me but Charlie Faust? And Charlie Faust said to me, he said, "Snow," he said, "I'm not very well, but he said, I think if you would prevail on Mr. McGraw to send me to Hot Springs a month before spring training, that I could get into shape and help you win another pennant." But unfortunately, that never came to pass because Charlie Faust died that winter and we did not win the pennant the next year.
So, unfortunately, a big fact check here. They didn't win the pennant in 1914, obviously. They were overtaken. They led most of the season, and the Miracle Braves made their miraculous charge from last place to overtake them. They finished second that year. I find it hard to believe that he would have run into Faust in Seattle, and maybe he could, so we can't say definitively, but here's how that went. Faust actually did return to Seattle. He had spent the latter part of 1912 after McGraw sent him away, and all of 1913, and again where the Giants won the pennant without him and lost again to Philadelphia in the World Series that year. But he peppered both the National League office and McGraw and the Giants, requesting that he be reinstated on the team and, of all things, get back pay for his contributions to their pennants during the time he was away. So he moved to California, and this is again in 1914, did odd jobs, and then joined his brother in Seattle, so he was actually in Seattle. But based on the timing, I don't think he would have been there during the time Snodgrass was doing a barnstorming tour through the Pacific Northwest. Because in